One of the one of the things that I love the most about playing sports, which if you don't know me, I love a lot. But one of the things that I love about it most is the drive to compete. That kind of like drive to constantly work to improve and to get better and to sharpen your skills and hone your craft, right? And that's kind of what separates sport from just games. Like games are played for fun and leisure. There's definitely ways to kind of enjoy various sports activities leisurely and to have fun while you're doing it. But in the very kind of classical sense of the word, in its essence, like sport requires striving and contending. That's why it was like such a backbone of ancient Greek culture. The Greeks kind of understood the gymnasium to be a formative place where real work happened, where men and their mettle were kind of forged in the crucible of athletic endeavor together, always driving and pushing for greatness. And one of the things that I love about following sports, about kind of the vast world of sports fandom, is the never-ending spirited debates over which athletes have kind of most achieved that pinnacle of greatness as they strive and they contend together. Who kind of made it? Who reached the mountaintop? Who are the best? We make up terms like the GOAT. And then between cubicles and over Buffalo Wings and across the world, we compare stats and we make hypothetical arguments and we try to kind of collectively determine who did it best. Some of the arguments are easy, right? Gretzky's the best to ever lace up a pair of skates. Now, the argument that he's the greatest goal scorer is about to get harder to make because Ovi is now within single digits of overtaking his record. But even if you take away every single goal that he ever scored, he's still the all-time points leader with like 1,900 some assists, right? It's an open and shut case. Another one of those discussions that I think seems to be a pretty open and shut case at this point pertains to the game of basketball. And the question, who is the all-time greatest shooter? Not the greatest scorer. If you ask the greatest scorer, that brings in names like Jordan and Kobe into the discussion. It kind of like evokes memories of Wilt Chamberlain and his 100 points in a single game that's probably never going to be broken. But who is just kind of the purest shooter of the basketball? One of the names that would be kind of in contention there would be Steve Kerr. Kerr was a teammate of Jordan's on the Chicago Bulls, and he still holds the record for the all-time highest shooting percentage in NBA history. When teams were kind of preoccupied covering Jordan and Pippen and Rodman inside, the Bulls would just kind of kick the ball out to the arc where Steve Kerr kind of regularly left uncovered because the Bulls just had too many weapons to cover all at once. And he would just reliably and consistently kind of drain clutch shots in huge moments. And considering the fact that no one has kind of ever done that with more precision or more consistency, it would seem like Kerr would be kind of a lock for the answer to that question. Except that if you ask Steve Kerr, if you sat Steve Kerr down and asked him that question, he would vehemently deny the title that he's the best shooter of all time. Why? Because Steve Kerr went on to be a coach in the league and coached a young point guard named Steph Curry. Earlier this week, Steph Curry just made his 4,000th three-point shot. The next closest player to him in terms of three-pointers made is like 900 shots behind him. It's not even close. And when his coach, Steve Kerr, is asked in interviews about comparisons between him and his star shooter, Kerr just kind of quickly brushes the question aside and is like between me and Steph, please, there's not even a comparison. I could never in my life have made the shots that Steph makes on a daily basis. Every team that we play drapes guys all over him. I played with Michael. The other teams were covering Michael. I was wide open. Steph makes shots from everywhere with two guys in his face. Steph makes shots that I wouldn't have even had the courage to attempt to make, and he makes them every single night. I might have a higher career percentage, but at the end of the day, my name isn't worthy of even being in the same conversation as Steph Curry. He's a class all his own. Steve Kerr has regularly said this in multiple interviews. Now, that is a great reflection of Steve Kerr's humility, but it's also a pretty definitive statement about Steph's greatness to have that kind of adamant recognition from someone who has that level of skill and status. The expression that we use for that is game recognized game, right? The guys that have game, the best of the best to do it. When they see it in someone else, they know it. They're like, this guy's good. How do I know that? Because I was good. I know what good looks like. I really wanted to title this sermon "Game Recognized Game." Because as Luke transitions us from Jesus' sermon back into the narrative, that is the emphasis of the first story that he tells us. As Jesus concludes this kind of extended teaching, Luke tells us that he returns to Capernaum. He begins moving about the region again. And it's again Jesus' authority that stands out on full display. And the first one to recognize it is going to be a man of great authority himself. Game recognized game. He sees this authority in Jesus and he says, I get it. I know what I'm seeing, and it is a league far beyond my own. Let's read again. When he had concluded saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. A centurion's servant who was highly valued by him was sick and about to die. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, requesting him to come and save the life of his servant. When they reached Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this because he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue." There's a Roman centurion who has a servant who matters to him a great deal, and his servant is sick and near to death. The centurion hears that Jesus is coming near, that he's re-entered Capernaum, this Jewish teacher who's been doing many signs and wonders, who's been healing people of their diseases and casting out demons. Remember earlier in the Gospel, Luke already told us that news about him is beginning to spread through the region. The centurion has heard the news and desires to kind of send for Jesus on behalf of his dying servant. So he reaches out to the elders, the leaders of the Jewish community, and asks for their help, that they might go and seek out this rabbi and request that he would come and save his servant's life. And they do it, which is kind of remarkable. I would imagine that these Jewish elders aren't Rome's biggest fan club. And yet, Luke tells us that they, not only did they kind of go on this errand to find Jesus and bring him back, but they pleaded with Jesus earnestly to this end. There's a couple things that I think are kind of helpful for us at this point to recognize right off the bat. And this is the first of those, which is that this centurion seems to have several points in his favor. There's multiple indications of high character here. He cares about his servant enough to go to these lengths to intervene. He isn't too proud to ask for help, but he approaches the leaders of the Jewish community for help. He's not trying to throw his weight around and use his influence to demand an audience with Jesus. He's making a request. And above all of this, the elders of the community don't seem to undertake the task reluctantly, but rather they do so willingly and earnestly. They speak of their admiration for his character, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this. He loves our people. He's even built us a synagogue." These are not things that would be said about the majority of occupying Roman military personnel. That they are men kind of worthy of doing this because of the love that they've shown for the Jewish people. And that kind of brings me to the second thing that I think we should keep in mind here. Luke is writing this gospel to a Gentile named Theophilus with the stated purpose that Theophilus might know with certainty the things that he's heard about Jesus. And then he begins verse 3 here with, when the centurion heard about Jesus. Perhaps Luke is kind of holding out for Theophilus this example of a Gentile who heard about Jesus and then responded with such certainty and no doubt about Jesus' authority as he is kind of encouraging the same of Theophilus as he writes to him. And even on top of this, like at the time of writing this letter, there's probably no issue as prominent and pressing in the early church as the issue of the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. The church in Luke's day is now made up of Jewish Christians who had been observing the law of Moses their entire life, and non-Jews who had heard the gospel and believed, but they had never lived under the ceremony of the law. And practically, that just caused some friction. That's just the reality of coming together from different backgrounds. We talk about this anytime we're working with a couple through premarital counseling, right? I had this conversation with Nastia and Bogdan a few months ago. Like, whenever you're coming from different backgrounds, there's bound to be some friction there. If one person comes from a family where kind of processed foods are a big no-no, someone else comes from a family where kind of trips through the fast food drive-through are a regular treat that families do together, there's going to be potential for some friction or there. If one person's kind of used to observing frequent movie nights, the other person is used to observing strict screen time limitations, you're going to have to kind of work out what you're going to do together in the evenings. In Luke's day, the church is made up of former rabbinical students who have memorized large portions of the Torah, and it's also made up of the new Greek family who just showed up with pork ribs at the potluck. Like, there's practical things that need to be figured out here. There's a learning curve to that. What does corporate life look like together when our lives are so different? And Luke is reminding his readers of this very early example from the ministry of Jesus, of a Gentile leader who used his own money to help fund the building of a synagogue, and Jewish elders who used their time and their voice to plead for the concerns of their Roman neighbor. And I really want to kind of get into the meat of what I think Luke is doing with this passage, but I also think that I would be remiss if I didn't kind of pause here for a short kind of applicational aside. I had a conversation one time with a brother at another church, and he was sharing with me how he wasn't quite sure if he belonged, like if he really fit in at the church. I remember him saying, like, I just feel like if it wasn't for church, I wouldn't really be friends with all these people. We just don't really click. Kind of worried that I don't really fit. As I thought about what he was saying, my response to him was like, well, I mean, yeah, like the church has always kind of been that way. The zealots and tax collectors don't really click. Former Pharisees and former prostitutes don't necessarily vibe. There's not a lot of like natural cohesion between a devout Jewish mother who closely practices every ritual washing and maintains careful distinction within the home between clean and unclean, and the Gentile butcher who spends most days with pig's blood up to his elbows. Like they don't have a lot of kind of like natural affinity. So if you've ever felt that way, or if you're even like new here and everyone just kind of seems like really different than you, that's just kind of the way things are. If you're struggling with that same question, like if it wasn't for church, I'm not sure if we'd all like naturally be friends. I mean, yeah, I don't know. Like maybe not. I don't know. But that's kind of part of what the beauty of what the church is. We have one thing that unites us, the blood of Jesus. That means there are many, many different things that don't unite us. Because we have one thing in common. We love the Lord because he first loved us. We love his people because he does. That means that there's lots of things we're not going to have in common. I know there exist out there kind of your cowboy churches or your biker churches or your college churches. But I do really think that all seems to kind of cut against what the church actually is. We have one binding affinity, Christ our Lord, period, the end, that's it. And if there's any kind of like additional characteristic that you need, or any additional group that you need to belong to, or any other kind of like demographic that you need to fall in order to take part, that's a different gospel. So if you're fighting with any of that, if you're fighting with that at all, let these details that Luke points out and kind of the reminder about the church that Luke is writing to be a source of comfort to you. Do you fit in here? It depends on what you mean. Are you asking, like, do you share a lot of things in common, and are you going to naturally click with everyone? I'm not sure. Like, probably not. Most of us don't. But are you asking, did Jesus shed his own blood for the redemption of your sins? Yes. Okay, well then there's your answer to whether you fit in. After the elders come and find Jesus, let's see what it is that he does next. Luke tells us Jesus went with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to tell him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, since I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. That's why I didn't even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under my command. I say to this one, go, and he goes. To another, come, and he comes. To my servant, do this, and he does it." Jesus accompanies them back to the home of the centurion, but before they reach the house, centurion sends word and says, I'm not worthy to receive you into my house. Some have argued that this is kind of like a matter of ritual uncleanness, that the centurion, because he's good friends with the Jewish community, he's kind of aware that Jesus will become ritually unclean if he enters the home of a Gentile. But the next statement would seem to suggest that's not really what's at play here, because the centurion says, that's why I didn't even consider myself worthy to come to you. Like this isn't just a matter of kind of who's under whose roof. This military commander, in very genuine humility, is making a statement about Jesus's greatness. Like Steve Kerr saying, I'm not worthy of even being mentioned in the same conversation as Steph Curry. Or if you ever kind of like watched a basketball game where someone makes a unbelievably ridiculous play and the whole bench kind of like falls out of their seats. They're so impressed. It's one of my favorite things about watching basketball is watching the bench and how they react to what their teammates do. But one of the things that you'll see them do is they all kind of like start like fake bowing to their teammate who just made an amazing play and saying like, we're not worthy. We're not worthy. This centurion is saying that in all honesty. And in all sincerity, like, I am not worthy. This guy is in a league all his own. Your greatness far surpasses mine. I'm not worthy even to be in your presence. This is a significant point. Luke even emphasizes it with the contrast between the elders saying, he is worthy for you to grant this, and him now twice saying, I am not worthy. But how does the centurion know this? Like, what has so utterly convinced him that he's unworthy? That's kind of his next point. He knows this because game recognized game. For I too am a man of authority. I have soldiers under my command. I say go, they go. I say come, they come. I say jump, they ask how high. What is he saying? He's saying, I know what it looks like to command things, to be in charge, to wield authority. Jesus, you say the word, and my servant will be healed. This is remarkable. You say be healed, and the sickness is going to leave my servant's body because the authority that you exercise over illness and disease is like the authority that I exercise over my servants and over my troops. My servant is next to death, but Jesus, death is your subordinate. You are its commanding officer. You give it an order, it's going to listen to you. News about Jesus has begun spreading through the region. He's been healing disease and he's been casting out demons, and this centurion has been watching. He's been listening, and he recognizes that illness, that like invisible, silent thing that none of us can stop or control. Like, listen, this winter has been rough on the illness front. I'm not sure any of us have kind of come through unscathed. A few weeks ago, I was doubled over a bucket, and I too felt near to death. But there's no escaping it. There's no controlling it. There's no keeping it out. It doesn't matter how many precautions you take. It doesn't matter how much vitamin C you pregame with. You can't batten down the hatches and defend the keep and arm yourself with a shotgun and pace up and down at your porch at night, keeping watch to make sure that illness doesn't claim your wife and kids. I could do all of those things, and still, in the middle of the night, I'm going to hear a small, weak cry from the bathroom floor saying, "Daddy, I don't feel so good." It got us multiple times. Why? Because I was powerless to stop it. And I'm guessing that at some point over the last few months, sickness probably found its way into the sanctity of your home at one point or another, too. Why? Because you were powerless to stop it. It didn't matter if you kind of drummed up every amount of willpower you can. You can't stand guard and keep sickness from finding its way in through your door. All of us have been helpless and powerless to stop it since pestilence entered the world in Genesis 3. And yet, this centurion has kept his eyes and his ears open, and he has noticed it obeys Jesus like my servants obey me. He reassigns demons like I dictate troop movements. This is the main point that we are meant to see. Jesus' authority is unparalleled. As someone well-versed in lesser forms of authority so unmistakably recognizes, Jesus' authority is unparalleled. And Jesus exercises that authority. When those who had been sent to him returned to the house, they found the servant in good health. They didn't just find the servant on the mend. He's in good health. The authority that the centurion recognizes, he recognizes accurately. Jesus exercises no less authority than that today. I shared this in our monthly prayer gathering, but it's too good for me to not share it again. Too often, we shrink the gospel down to just, Jesus died for your sins, the end. But the gospel isn't patterned as kind of one euphoric moment of climax and then just a whole bunch of falling action. In the sequel to this gospel, the book of Acts, Jesus writes again to Theophilus and tells him that all the things that Jesus did before ascending to the right hand of the Father are only the beginning of all that he has done and all that he's doing. The gospel is shaped more like this. From eternity past, God elected to salvation. The eternal Son took on flesh and became a man that by his poverty we might be made rich. He lived a perfect, sinless life that we couldn't in our place. He died the perfect substitutionary death that we couldn't in our place. He was raised to new life that we might too be raised with him. He ascended on high, where right now he actively rules and reigns at the right hand of the Father. And he's coming again to judge the living and the dead and to usher in the full glory of his forever kingdom. The good news runs from eternity past to eternity future. It's not one moment. But where are we right now in this gospel diagram? Where do we exist? Where does the church exist? Where was the Gospel of Luke written? Where was the early church born? Where was King's Table planted? Where were you saved? Where do you wake up every single morning of every single day of your life? You wake up underneath the present and active reign of Jesus. Christian, that should radically affect how you live. You wake up every single day of your life underneath the present and active reign of Jesus. And the authority that he exercises here in Luke 7 is no less than the authority that he currently exercises right now. The kind of authority that makes this centurion acknowledge, like, Jesus, you say the word and my servant is healed. How much time do you spend worrying? How much of your week, how much of your day is given to worry? How much effort do you exert trying to gain or maintain control? Like, how much does trying to kind of stay in control and manage everything exhaust you? Why? What a waste of time. What do you need to be in control for? He's already got it. He's presently reigning. And he's way better at using control than you are. He's way better at exercising authority than you are. The fact that you live underneath the present rule of Jesus and that he exercises every bit of authority that we see him exercise here in this text. Like, think with me for just a minute what kind of things that means for you. Are you struggling to believe that you or someone else can actually change? Maybe you're tired and you're discouraged and you just feel like you keep making the same mistakes over and over. Can you really change? Maybe you're kind of like further along in years. Everyone always says that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You're just kind of like, after many years of kind of doing things my own way, can I really actually change? Maybe someone that you loved hurt you a lot. If you forgive them, aren't they going to just hurt you again? Can people really change? Yes. Friends, the answer to all of those questions is yes. Yes, because we are living beneath the present and active rule and reign of Jesus. And we should respond to that fact the way that the centurion does here. Jesus recognizes his words and actions as an expression of great faith. Jesus heard this and was amazed at him. Turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, I tell you, I have not found so great a faith even in Israel. Jesus just finished teaching a sermon, right? A sermon on what it looks like to be his people, that it looks like kind of laying down present riches, loving one's enemies, growing in humility and mercy to be able to help one's brothers. And then Luke gives us a great example of someone actually doing that. And it's a Roman. Jesus preaches, this is what my people are like. And then the first story that Luke gives us right after that is a Roman military officer being the one who exhibits those qualities. He doesn't throw around his present riches. He makes himself poor in spirit and says, I'm not worthy even to come to you. He doesn't only help those who help him. He actively cares for those who hate him and oppose his very presence and builds a synagogue. And in their own words, loves the Jewish people. He humbles himself that he might help his brother, even his servant who's close to death. And Jesus says, I have not found so great a faith even in Israel. How hard would it be for the disciples to hear that? How hard would it be for some of Luke's readers with kind of mounting persecution coming from Rome to read that? To read, this is what Jesus' people look like. And hey, you know who modeled that really well? This Roman soldier. No! They're supposed to be the bad guys. Don't make him the example of someone who did this well. As hard as it might be to hear, Jesus takes bad guys and makes them good guys. And sometimes you might find that uncomfortable. This is actually a really good reason to start practicing that whole loving your enemies thing. Because it's entirely possible that Jesus could take that enemy and make them your brother. So you might want to get a head start on loving them now, because Jesus does change people. And he's not going to ask your consent before he does it. He's not going to come to you and say, hey, are you okay if I change this one? Are you okay with having them as a brother? But as hard as that is to hear, it's also the sweetest and most relieving thing to hear. It's the good news that your eternity depends on, that Jesus takes the bad guys and makes them good guys. That he takes the unexpected, the unqualified, the hated, the unlikely, the ones that don't fit, and makes them his people, because that's who all of us have been, and Jesus makes us his. What other response could there be to that than the one that the centurion gives here? I'm not worthy. Jesus' authority is on full display, and our response to that authority must be one that admits our own unworthiness, one that recognizes his far surpassing worthiness, and one that lays everything down because of it. The defining factor of your entire life will be what you do with Jesus' authority. And I don't think we need to say it any softer than that. The defining factor of your entire life, the single issue that your whole existence hinges on, is what are you going to do with Jesus' authority? That's the conclusion that much of Luke's gospel has been building to. All the miracles, all the affirmations of his divine sonship, he has come with authority, all authority. And now the question moving forward, the question that's going to reverberate and grow in volume through Luke's gospel as the mission of the upside down kingdom unfolds and expands, is what are you going to do with his authority? Because some will plot to kill him, some will anoint him with worship, and who responds how is going to be unpredictable. You're not going to be able to identify the good soil from the bad soil until you see the fruit. Some are going to respond in worship, and they're going to be Roman military officers. Some are going to plot to kill him, and they're going to be holy men and religious leaders who know the law. But let each passage that we walk through over the coming weeks, over the coming months, let each passage, each parable, each miracle that we encounter be to you like a mirror, holding up for you Jesus' authority and asking the question, what will you do now? How will you respond? Because the defining factor of your entire life will be what you do with Jesus' authority. Let's pray.